I never imagined that one weekend in the woods could change everything. It was supposed to be simple. 2 old friends, a tent, and a couple of days away from the grind of city life. But life has a way of turning the simplest plans into something unexpected, something unforgettable. Ryan and I had been best friends since college. He was the kind of guy who could walk into a room and instantly have everyone's attention, all easy smiles and confidence. Me? I was quieter, more reserved, content to let him shine while I stood in the background. Over the years, our friendship had survived moves, jobs, and even relationships, and somehow we always found our way back to each other. When he suggested a camping trip, I jumped at the chance. It had been years since we'd done something like this, just the 2 of us. "Disconnect from the world for a bit," he'd said. "No phones, no emails, just nature." I liked the idea of getting away, but there was another part of me, one I rarely let myself think about, that was nervous. Spending a weekend alone with Ryan meant being around him without the distractions of everyday life. It meant facing the quiet moments where my feelings for him might bubble too close to the surface. The drive to the campsite was a few hours long, winding through hills and dense patches of forest that seemed to swallow the sunlight whole. Ryan drove, his arm resting casually on the edge of the window, the breeze ruffling his hair. He looked completely at ease, humming along to the music playing softly on the radio. I couldn't help but steal glances at him, the golden light filtering through the trees, casting a warm glow over his face. "You've been quiet," he said suddenly, catching me off guard. He smirked, his blue eyes flicking to me briefly before returning to the road. "Getting cold feet about roughing it in the wild?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Just soaking it all in. You know, the calm before you start snoring loud enough to scare off the wildlife." Ryan grinned, his teeth flashing white against his tanned skin. "If anything's gonna scare the wildlife, it's your cooking." I rolled my eyes but couldn't hide my smile. This was what I loved about being around Ryan. He had a way of making everything feel lighter, easier. Even now, as my stomach churned with nerves I couldn't quite name, he made me forget, if only for a moment. We reached the campsite just before dusk, the sun dipping low behind the trees and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Ryan parked the car and we set to work unloading our gear. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, their songs fading as the evening settled in. "You take the tent," Ryan said, tossing the bag at me with a grin. "I'll handle the fire, unless you want to sleep in the car." I caught the bag, shaking my head. "I can manage. Just try not to burn the forest down, okay?" He saluted me with a mock-serious expression. Scout's honor. As we worked, the silence between us felt comfortable, broken only by the occasional crackle of leaves underfoot, or the scrape of metal against stone as Ryan built the fire pit. I stole glances at him every now and then, watching the way his muscles flexed beneath his shirt as he crouched to arrange the wood. The way the firelight danced in his eyes when he finally got it going was mesmerizing, and I had to force myself to look away before he caught me staring. The tent went up without too much trouble, and soon we were sitting around the fire, the warmth chasing away the evening chill. Ryan had brought a small cooler and we cracked open a couple of beers, the sound of the caps hissing off echoing in the quiet. "To a weekend of absolutely nothing," Ryan said, raising his bottle. I clinked mine against his, smiling. "To disconnecting." We drank in companionable silence for a while, the crackle of the fire filling the space between us. The stars began to appear overhead, faint at first, then brighter and more numerous as the sky darkened. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet wash over me, but my mind was anything but calm. Being here, alone with Ryan, felt both exhilarating and dangerous. Over the years, I'd gotten good at keeping my feelings for him locked away, tucked into a corner of my heart where they couldn't hurt me. But now, sitting across from him with nothing but the firelight between us, I felt those walls start to crumble. "You look lost in thought," Ryan said, pulling me from my reverie. I glanced at him, his face partially shadowed but his eyes bright and curious. Just tired, I said, taking another sip of my beer. He tilted his head, studying me. You sure? You've been acting weird since we got here. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Just a lot on my mind, I guess. Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Anything you want to talk about? No, I started, but the words caught in my throat as his gaze locked onto mine. There was something about the way he looked at me, so open and sincere, that made it impossible to lie. It's nothing, I finished weakly, breaking eye contact. He didn't push, but the look he gave me lingered, a mixture of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite place. Eventually, he leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms over his head with a contented sigh. All right, he said, his tone light, but if you're planning to murder me out here in the middle of nowhere, at least wait until I've had a s'more. I laughed, grateful for the change in tone. You're safe, for now. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of laughter and easy conversation, the tension from earlier fading into the background. By the time we crawled into the tent, the fire reduced to glowing embers, I felt more at ease, though my mind still buzzed with unspoken thoughts. We laid out our sleeping bags side by side, the small space forcing us closer than I was entirely comfortable with. Ryan stretched out, his arms behind his head, and I tried not to notice how his shirt rode up slightly, exposing a sliver of skin. This is nice, he said after a while, his voice low in the darkness. We should do stuff like this more often. Yeah, I agreed, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence stretched between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. I could hear the faint rustle of the wind outside, the distant call of an owl, the steady rhythm of Ryan's breathing. It was calming and maddening all at once, being so close to him but knowing he was just out of reach. I turned onto my side, my back to him, hoping sleep would come quickly. But as the minutes ticked by, I found myself hyper-aware of every movement, every sound, the way his breathing hitched slightly when he shifted closer, the warmth of his body radiating against my back. Hey, Ryan's voice broke the quiet, soft and hesitant. I froze, my heart pounding. Yeah? He hesitated, and for a moment I thought he might change his mind about whatever he was going to say. But then his hand brushed against my arm, tentative but deliberate, and my breath caught. Is everything okay? He asked, his voice barely audible. I turned to face him, my eyes searching his in the dim light. Yeah, I said, though the words felt hollow. Why wouldn't it be? Ryan's gaze lingered on mine, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression that made my chest tighten. Uncertainty, vulnerability, and something else, something that sent a shiver down my spine. Because you seem different, he said quietly, and I can't tell if it's me or you. I stared at him, my heart hammering in my chest. His words hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded with meaning I didn't know how to interpret. The dim light from the dying embers of the fire outside cast flickering shadows across his face, softening his features but doing nothing to dull the intensity in his gaze. What do you mean? I finally asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Ryan shifted, propping himself up on one elbow. His face was close enough now that I could make out every detail. The faint stubble on his jaw, the curve of his lips, the uncertainty in his eyes. I don't know, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. I just feel like there's something you're not saying. I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. He was right, of course. There was a storm of things I wasn't saying, things I couldn't say, because once they were out there, I couldn't take them back. But in this moment, with his hand resting inches from mine and his eyes searching mine for answers, the walls I'd so carefully built began to crack. It's nothing, I lied, forcing a smile. I'm just tired. Ryan didn't look convinced. His eyes flicked to my mouth for the briefest of moments before returning to my eyes, and the air between us seemed to thicken. You sure? He asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though my heart was screaming at me to say something, to tell him the truth. But I couldn't. Not now. Not like this. Ryan held my gaze for a moment longer before nodding. "Okay," he said, lying back down. "Good night." "Good night," I murmured, turning onto my back and staring up at the roof of the tent. My mind was racing, my thoughts tangled in a web of fear and longing. I listened to the steady rhythm of Ryan's breathing as he drifted off to sleep, and for a moment I let myself imagine what it would be like to close the distance between us, to tell him everything. But I didn't. Instead, I closed my eyes and willed myself to sleep, though it felt like an eternity before it finally came. The next morning, I woke to the sound of bird song and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Ryan was already up, crouched by the fire pit and poking at the embers with a stick. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across his back as he worked, his movements fluid and unhurried. "Morning," he said when he noticed me, flashing a grin that made my chest ache. "Hope you're ready for some gourmet breakfast." I glanced at the makeshift cooking setup and raised an eyebrow. If by gourmet you mean instant oatmeal, then yeah, I'm ready. Ryan laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "Don't underestimate my culinary skills. You'll be begging for my recipe by the time we're done." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. This was how it always was with Ryan. Easy, effortless, like slipping into a well-worn pair of shoes. It was one of the things I loved most about him, even if I'd never admit it out loud. We ate breakfast by the fire, the conversation light and full of teasing. It felt almost normal, like the moment we'd shared in the tent the night before hadn't happened. But every so often I'd catch Ryan looking at me, his expression unreadable, and the memory of his words would resurface, making my heart race all over again. After breakfast, we decided to go for a hike. The trail wound through the forest, the trees towering above us like silent sentinels. The air was cool and filled with the earthy scent of moss and pine, and for a while we walked in companionable silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot. "This was a good idea," I said after a while, breaking the silence. "Getting away from everything." Ryan glanced at me, his lips quirking into a small smile. "Yeah. Feels good to unplug for a bit, just us and the trees." "Exactly," I said, though the words felt heavier than they should. Just us. The thought sent a flicker of nervous energy through me, but I pushed it aside, focusing instead on the trail ahead. As the day wore on, the tension between us began to build again, subtle but unmistakable. It was in the way his hand brushed against mine when he pointed out something on the trail, the way his gaze lingered a second too long when he thought I wasn't looking. And I knew I wasn't imagining it, because every time our eyes met there was something there, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. By the time we returned to the campsite, the sun was beginning to set, casting the forest in a warm, golden light. Ryan suggested we gather more firewood before it got dark, and I agreed, grateful for the distraction. We worked in relative silence, the sound of snapping branches and the occasional rustle of leaves filling the air. But as the pile of wood grew, so did the tension, until it felt like a living thing between us, pulsing with every glance, every accidental touch. At one point, as I bent to pick up a fallen branch, Ryan's hand brushed against mine. The contact was brief but enough to send a jolt of electricity through me, and when I looked up, I found him staring at me, his expression unreadable. "Sorry," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "It's fine," I replied, though my heart was racing. I stood, brushing the dirt from my hands, and tried to ignore the way he was looking at me. But then he stepped closer, closing the distance between us. My breath caught, and I froze, unsure of what to do. His gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment neither of us moved, the air between us charged with something I couldn't name. "Is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" I managed, my throat dry. "Fine," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Because it doesn't feel fine." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stare at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Ryan, I started, but he cut me off, his hand reaching out to brush against my arm. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a shiver through me. "Tell me to stop," he said softly, his voice barely audible. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I stepped closer, my hand finding his, and for the first time, I let myself hope. The air between us felt like it had been electrified, every sound in the forest fading away until the only thing I could hear was the pounding of my heart. Ryan's hand lingered on my arm, his touch burning into my skin even through the fabric of my sleeve. His eyes searched mine, full of questions and uncertainties, but also something deeper, something that made it impossible to look away. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what was happening, for the way the world seemed to tilt and shift around us as if the very ground we stood on was no longer steady. I was hyper-aware of everything. The warmth of his breath against my cheek, the way his fingers twitched slightly as if he was holding himself back, the rapid rise and fall of his chest as he struggled to steady his breathing. "Ryan," I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. But before I could say anything else, he leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. His lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative, as though he was testing the waters, waiting for me to tell him it was too much. But it wasn't. If anything, it wasn't enough. My breath hitched, and before I could stop myself, I was kissing him back, my hand reaching up to tangle in his hair as I pulled him closer. The kiss deepened, and the world around us seemed to disappear entirely. There was only Ryan, the way his lips moved against mine, the way his hands slid to my waist, anchoring me to him, the way his body pressed against mine like he couldn't get close enough. It was everything I had wanted for so long but never dared to hope for, and it was overwhelming in the best possible way. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads resting together as we tried to process what had just happened. Ryan's hands were still on my waist, his thumbs brushing against my sides in a way that sent shivers up my spine. He started, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He pulled back slightly, his eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or uncertainty. I don't know what that was. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I struggled to find the right words, something that could encompass everything I was feeling, but nothing seemed adequate. It was real. Ryan's gaze snapped to mine, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed my words. For a moment, I thought he might argue, that he might try to take it back and brush it off as a mistake. But then he nodded, his grip on my waist tightening slightly. "Yeah," he said softly. It was. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the forest around us silent and still as though it, too, was holding its breath. I wanted to say something, to ask him what this meant or where we went from here, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached up, my hand brushing against his cheek, and he leaned into my touch, his eyes fluttering shut. "I've wanted this," he admitted, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear him. I didn't know how much until now. His confession hit me like a punch to the gut, stealing the air from my lungs. For years, I had convinced myself that what I felt for Ryan was one-sided, that he could never feel the same way about me. And now, hearing him say those words, it was almost too much to process. "Me too," I said, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I couldn't put into words. "God, me too." Ryan's eyes opened, and the look in them made my knees weak. It was raw and vulnerable, a side of him I had rarely seen, and it made my heart ache in the best possible way. He leaned down again, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was softer this time, more deliberate, as though he was trying to memorize every detail. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against mine, his hands moving to cup my face. "This changes everything," he murmured, his breath warm against my lips. Maybe it doesn't have to, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Deep down, I knew this wasn't something we could just brush under the rug or pretend never happened. But in this moment, with his hands on my face and his lips still tingling against mine, I couldn't bring myself to care. Ryan smiled then, a small, crooked smile that made my chest ache. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "One step at a time." The walk back to the campsite was quiet, but it wasn't the awkward silence I had feared. Instead, it felt almost peaceful, like we had reached some sort of unspoken understanding. Ryan's hand brushed against mine as we walked, and though neither of us said anything, the touch was enough to send a shiver down my spine. When we reached the campsite, the fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing. Ryan moved to stoke the flames, his movements deliberate but unhurried, and I watched him, my chest tightening with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. When the fire was roaring again, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Sit with me?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, crossing the clearing to join him by the fire. He waited until I was seated before lowering himself onto the log beside me, close enough that our knees brushed. For a while, we just sat there, staring into the flames, the silence between us comfortable but charged. "I've been thinking about this all day," Ryan said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, and I turned to look at him, my heart skipping a beat at the vulnerability in his expression. "About you." "Ryan," I started, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "Let me say this," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "I don't know what's happening between us. I don't know what it means or what comes next, but I know that I don't want to ignore it anymore." His words hit me like a tidal wave, washing over me and leaving me breathless. For so long, I had convinced myself that my feelings for Ryan were a secret I would carry alone, something I would never dare to share. And now, hearing him say those words, it was like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. "I don't want to ignore it either," I admitted, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I was feeling. "But it scares me." "Me too," Ryan said, his hand reaching out to cover mine. "But I'd rather face it with you than keep pretending it's not there." The fire crackled softly, the warmth of it chasing away the evening chill, but it was nothing compared to the heat of Ryan's hand on mine. I turned to look at him, my heart racing, and before I could stop myself I leaned in, my lips brushing against his in a kiss that felt like coming home. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and I let myself get lost in him, the way his lips moved against mine, the way his hands slid up my back, the way he whispered my name like it was something sacred. When we finally pulled away, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads resting together as we tried to process what had just happened. Ryan's hands cupped my face, his thumbs brushing against my cheeks, and he smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made my chest ache. "We'll figure it out," he said again, his voice steady and filled with quiet conviction. "Together." "Together," I echoed, and for the first time I truly believed it.